thank you to you and to the folks at CITL for inviting Laura and I to be part of the instructor series, and we're delighted to be joining you. I'm here in the basement of the Faculty of Education building, and Lauren is joining us from her office at Mount Royal University in Calgary. So just really briefly as an introduction, I'm Connie. I've been an assistant professor here at the Faculty of Education for a little while, and I've been teaching here at the faculty since about 2007 in a number of different roles that have evolved up to the position that I'm in currently. Before that, I was an English language arts high school teacher in schools in and around Metro St. John's and CBS. And it's there where I learned first about the literature circle model as an alternative way to assess students, particularly in English language arts class. And so what we're going to share with you today is how the seeds of that learning have evolved into different kinds of assessment that I do in my current undergraduate teaching and gesture towards where I'm going with my graduate school teaching. But also, Lauren has taken this idea and is taking it a little bit further and in a completely different direction, which is exciting, and I'm thrilled to share it. So I'm going to get Lauren to introduce herself now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having us. I'm assuming you can hear me all good? Yes. Can I get a thumbs up in the room? Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren at Mount Royal University in our information design program here. I'm also new to this role in that I started back in January. Before that, I was the academic chair for data analytics and artificial intelligence at SAIT, which is a polytechnic here in Calgary, as well as the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. And my role there was designing programs, specifically designing their integrated artificial intelligence program. So I'm coming at this idea of lit circles and being in the classroom from a slightly different perspective, more from that industry technology focused and looking at maybe stepping away from the traditional use of a literature circle, that being literature itself, and jumping into different applied focuses where we can take that same model and apply it to our different courses and materials. I'm actually an alum of Memorial University, so always happy to come back and get to chat with folks from my hometown. I did my undergrad in psychology at MUN. Okay, so jumping into this, what are we actually doing today and what are we covering? Well, first we're going to talk a bit about what lit circles are and how they function and the history behind them, talking about from K-12 literacy to graduate school applications. Then we'll look into the alternative applications and more of what I'm doing with this in my usability classes now for our information designers. And also a little bit about what those two things are, because I realize that information design isn't exactly a common department at most schools. Then we'll talk a bit about evaluation and what that can look like within this space. And then, of course, with any type of assessment or with any type of model for learning, we have to address the giant elephant in the universe, because I think it's taken over not just this room, but every room, and that is addressing artificial intelligence and our concern around plagiarism and how lit circles can actually be a great tool for maybe not combating AI, but circumventing some of the challenges that those face. And then we'll finish up with a Q&A so we can make this into a bit of an interactive discussion. Okay, and without further ado, let's get this started.
All right, thanks, Lauren.
I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about how literature circles evolved, at least from the perspective of my experience, and how I came to start using them in some of the courses that I teach at the undergraduate level here at MUN. Originally, literature circles were a tool that English language arts teachers turned to in the public school system to engage reluctant readers and often to give voice and multiple perspectives to young students who were struggling with reading, teachers who were trying to find a way to get kids to read stuff they didn't want to read, and to give them agency over choosing the material, but also develop a kind of authentic assessment where students could talk about the things they really wanted to talk about related to the literature that they were reading. There's a history that goes back to even to the 70s, so these have been around for a long time, with Louise Rosenblatt and her transactional reading theory. And in a very simplistic nutshell, her ideas were that students brought their experiences to bear on the reading that they did or on the stories that they were reading, and that there was this back and forth relationship between the text and the student experience and the author's words, and that they were all a valuable piece and made a contribution to a broader learning process. So that idea is resting and becoming part of the way English teachers' pedagogies were developing. And then along came a brilliant woman named Nancy Atwell from New England. And in the 80s, she wrote a book called In the Middle. She was teaching middle school grades, what we would call intermediate school. And she was finding, again, kids were reluctant, and she was really struggling to get them to read and to be able to have meaningful and authentic conversations. So she developed the idea of like the kitchen table talk, almost like a book talk for kids, where they would come together and kids would read a story, but they would all bring their individual experiences and perspectives to bear, and they would have a meaningful conversation. So it wasn't necessarily about a writing output; it was a speaking output, and all of this aligned in Atlantic Canada, at least, with an agenda in English language arts that attended to 6 strands of English language arts: reading, writing, listening, speaking, viewing, and representing. And all of these are encompassed in a literature circle model, because it's a group activity where kids get to have choice, but they get to draw, they get to write, they get to find media and create media and do all kinds of really interesting things, but related to the content that the teacher wanted them to engage. So when I was teaching high school, I was first introduced to this model as a way to get students to read books that otherwise they wouldn't. And as educators, whether we are at a high school level or whether we are at a university level, sometimes the challenge is to get our students to actually read the content we want them to and need them to read and engage with. And so at the high school level, we started introducing lit circles, which had been traditionally to the domain of younger grades, but we adapted the questions and we changed the format and the framing of it a little bit, and to make it a little bit more mature. And what we found was students absolutely loved it. And students who typically were not readers were actually coming to class with their reading done and their roles prepared, and were eager to have discussions with their peers in a way that didn't happen when we were running traditional classes, where we were telling them what they had to think about the readings that we were doing. And it was a much more authentic and meaningful learning process. And so in a way, it kind of was adopting principles of universal design learning long before that even became fashionable or common as it is now. From that point, when I started teaching English language arts methods at the undergraduate level here at the Faculty of Education, I subscribed to a philosophy or a pedagogy of see one, do one, teach one. So it was really important to me, for my students who are pre-service teachers, to have an opportunity to actually participate in this assessment model, so that they would not just learn about it from me, but they would actually engage in and participate in one, so that when they go into their internships or further into their early careers, they then can teach with a level of comfort, knowing what this lit circle beast looks like when it's in practice. And after a while, doing this at the undergraduate level, where my students would would choose groups and go into groups related to the discipline age where they would be placed for their internship. So the intermediate school teachers would group together, ideally in small groups. The senior high teachers would group together, ideally in small groups, and choose their novels and conduct the lit circle. They would then present back to the class a unit plan that they had developed based on a theme that emerged from the book that they had used. So again, trying to keep it really practical. So it's changing its intent from what it was in the high school situation, where students would read novels that they had chosen and then do a little group presentation about whether they thought the novel was worth reading again another time in another year. So now at the undergraduate level, students are reading a novel that they would teach. So it was still a spin on it, but still very connected. So after a couple of years of doing that, it dawned on me in another class that I was teaching, diversity and social justice, sometimes some of the students were struggling to get their reading done. And it occurred to me that I could use the model of lit circles in the diversity and social justice class to invite the students to work again in groups, to do assigned reading, and to have their conversations from the perspective of their roles, which I'll unpack in a minute and show you how that happens. What I found is that the students were engaging in these really important, deep, meaningful conversations that they might have been reluctant to have if it had been a whole class discussion. And so from the perspective of this course, the content was always the same rather than a choice of content in high school or a choice of content in English methods class. The students were reading the same content in small groups, but they were still coming to the lit circle with their roles and their perspectives and getting to share multiple points of view. Again, it was not meant or designed to be a written output kind of assessment. The written output is limited. It is about the reading, the thinking, and the critical discussion that happens, and the collegial discussion that happens within the group with the students. And what I found over the years was that students are just more willing to be accountable and to be, to bring authentic questions to a small peer group than they would be in a larger classroom setting where they would be invited to have an open dialogue. Can you change the slide, Lauren? Thank you. So for those of you who don't have experience doing lit circles, this all still might sound like it's a little confusing. So I'd like to go through just a few rules, and I don't mean these to be absolutely prescriptive. Of course, people can change them and modify them as they see fit. I've modified them a bazillion times myself, but there are some basic sort of rules of engagement that make it work based on my experience. So if the first one is that students generally would get to choose their own material. So at the high school level, students would choose the novels that they would read. So a group of 5 or 6 students would select one novel and they would each read that same novel. Another group would maybe select a different kind of novel based on their interests or reading levels. And so within a classroom, you might have multiple novels and lit circles happening at the same time. So it's a way to cover and diversify some content. At the English Language Arts methods class, it reflects that same high school model where my groups are all doing different novels and preparing different unit plans based on the novels that they've chosen. In the diversity and social justice class, we're all reading from the same textbook, and the readings have been assigned, and so they're all on the same page, but the discussions at every table are vastly different based on the experiences that the young and emerging pre-service teachers have to bear. I'm also looking at developing this, and I have been developing this to move into the graduate school level. And so I'd like to just say for just very briefly, within the graduate model, the expectation would be that students are also grouped into small groups, either randomly assigned or whether they pick that. That's still a detail we're working out. But students would read a combination of pre-assigned and chosen by them content, and would then bring their perspectives and different roles to bear, and then would, as a group, be responsible for creating a brief video content, piece of content to share with the rest of the class, to explain what it is they had talked about, talk about the articles they had found, more current research and literature or videos. And so the model is the same, but little bits of it change and adopt along the way. So the first thing is choice. The second piece is that there has to be some upfront planning. And so this is one of those assessment opportunities that the more organized you can be before it begins, the more seamlessly it seems to run. Whether it's deciding whether you're going to have the Brightspace tool randomly assign your students into groups of 5 or 6, or whether you allow your students to pick their groups, really depends on the intent you have or the goal you have for the Lit Circle, that if you're using that yourself. So if your students you want them to have an opportunity to come up against opinions and experiences that they normally would not, then I think random assignments in your class is a good idea. If you want them to have like-minded experiences, for example, I want my intermediate school teachers to come together because they are more likely to have things in common around the intent and purpose, then that would make more sense. So that will be completely up to you. The students at the very beginning need to create a schedule, almost like a log of here are the amount of days we have to complete this assignment. We're going to meet 5 different times. We've got to get through this book or these chapters within this amount of time, so let's divide it up. And they have to agree on how much content they will cover every day. They then have to decide which roles they will take, and I'll review the roles on the next slide, or in 2 slides, I think. They have to decide which roles they will take on and decide what the rotation of those roles will look like. I always allow time for them to plan before this happens, and you have to give that time in class time. Anybody who's been teaching at the undergrad or grad level knows how hard it is for groups to get together with all of their diverse schedules. So if you can provide 15 or 20 minutes for them in class to get that administrative work done and have that schedule planned, it will save you a ton of headaches in the end. So the third part is the rotation of roles, where students are given a list of potential roles that they will take on each day that they meet. The rules are that they can't repeat a role, and someone every day must be the discussion director or the facilitator for the discussion. And this will perhaps be a little clearer when I get to the different roles. Often I will allow maybe a choice of 8, sometimes even up to 10 roles, and students only have to complete 5 of them. It's completely their choice. Again, as long as they stay within the parameters that someone every day is going to be the discussion director and they don't repeat the role. It's kind of an enabling constraint that's built into this. And then in terms of what the students do, they will create talking points or bring content to share every day based on the role that they've chosen and the amount of reading that they have done. And again, just to reiterate what I had said before, it's not a writing assignment. Students will submit their notes at the end of each discussion portion of this activity and this assessment. I have them submit them to the Dropbox at the end of class, and that's just to keep them on track. It's not meant to be something they go home and write up a big long essay. It's not. These are just talking points around, what got discussed, what they didn't get a chance to talk about, or what was meaningful or salient in the readings that they wanted to bring forward. There's also an element of self-assessment, and we'll talk about this later on a slide near the end. There is a potential for peer assessment. I've had success and failure with that. And there is an element and a level of instructor assessment as well. Okay, perfect. All right, so what happens, this little beautiful graphic that Lauren's created, is that there's this rotation that just keeps going and going for the duration of the Lit Circle. At the undergrad level, I try to give 5 5 classes, and we're not giving over 5 complete classes. It's a short section or a short portion of the class. But students will choose the amount of reading and the roles that they will do the next day. They go home and they read and they prepare their talking notes. They come to class the next day and they meet at the beginning. I do it at the beginning of the class, but it doesn't have to be so. They meet for a period of time so that everybody has an opportunity to share, and then they agree upon how much they're going to read and what roles they're going to do for the next day. And this literally rotates until they're finished the assigned reading. Okay. So in high school, I've just shared a slide that will detail some of the roles that I've used in different contexts. And essentially, I don't have to go through this in detail, but essentially I've tried to move it to match the intention of what I hoped this assignment would capture. So in high school, I really just wanted students to read the book, and I wanted them to have something to talk about. So the idea of keeping the contributions and the roles kind of light and approachable and like something that they could do and it wouldn't take them a ton of time was really important. I would also, in a high school context, I would also have given them time at the end of class to read the book that they were sharing, just because high school students' relationship with homework is not always positive. So we really need to give them space for that. Once we get to the undergraduate level, and especially in the teacher education program, there's a different expectation around the homework and the kind of content that students will engage with and what they'll come to class having done and prepared. So we can assume that they're going to do the reading and they're going to prepare their roles in advance, but I would still give them that time at the beginning for their meeting. And I build that into the class. The roles that I ask them to do, ask them to dig in a little bit more. You'll see that there's still a discussion director. Most students do not pick the summarizer because that's quite frankly really boring, but every now and then a student likes to lean into something that feels comfortable. Connectors are people that connect something from the story to something that's happened, and it's very broad. All of these roles have written prompts and possible questions that will go along with them. So it's not just a role. There is a little bit more available to them. And if anyone is interested in those, they weren't slide friendly. So I would be happy to share the resources that I have. If you need those or would like those, I'd be happy to reach out. As we move into social justice class, the roles reflect more of a critical engagement with the text, and they invite a kind of reading that would allow students to dig in. Sometimes they would be invited to be a devil's advocate or a protester. The intent is to bring multiple perspectives to themes of race, class, gender, and ability. And so the text I use is very readable, even though the content is important and deep and meaningful, and it often requires students to sort of sit back and grapple with the ideas. So I wanted to invite them to really dig in and ask difficult questions. And so the roles that I've used for the social justice class, I hope reflect that. I've also included an in the classroom role. So by then the students have had their internship and they've been out and teaching in the classrooms, and they're getting ready for their first jobs. And so I want them to build up a bank, a toolkit of lesson plans. And so I invite them to develop lessons, and that's one of the roles. You come to class based on the reading that you've just done with a lesson that would address one of the themes in those readings. And as always, I give them an opportunity to choose a role other than one that is listed. And sometimes students will come with some really great and creative ideas, and I'm always open for those. Again, at the at the grad level, I'm looking at, again, another level of depth of reading, of contribution to the discussion. There are things like scholarly connector, media reflector. A lot of the students are keen to talk about what's in the public domain and what they've seen in pop culture. Again, advocate and protester, but again, attached to literature and scholarship. And again, in the classroom, they could also be invited to bring lesson ideas, but the level of their contribution would be more reflective of a grad class than undergrad. So, all right, you've heard from me a lot. So I'd like to turn this over to Lauren now.
Yeah, so just jumping off what we were just discussing and basically how these roles and how this can evolve from, you know, high school all the way up to grad school. When we step away from the education or the English language arts application for literature circles, that's when we can start talking more about, I guess, a different version of this, or a new version of lit circles going forward. So here's my shot at an alternative application for this, and something that I'm currently implementing in my third year usability course for my students. But for context, because I'm not quite sure what the background for our audience is, and I get the feeling that, you know, it might be widespread. What is UX or usability? Well, usability is how easy and efficiently we actually are able to use a product or a system for its intended use, whereas UX would be user experience, so the overall user experience. And the graphic I've got on screen here is just thinking about how you use this guy, your phone. Usability and user experience looks at everything from haptics to where does your thumb naturally reach when you're trying to accomplish something in an app. So if you look at the screen now and you were to imagine trying to, with one hand, order some takeout on Uber Eats or on some sort of food delivery app. Well, you have your phone, you know where your thumb can reach. If you're holding it with your right hand, that'll show you the green, yellow, and red on the right-hand side, and then left hand and both. So it's meant to be thinking about how do we actually design technology, digital or otherwise, to better work for the people, the intended users. But what does this have to do with lit reviews? Well, this becomes a practical evolution of the literature review in the classroom for usability studies. When we think about lit reviews, there's a lot of participant action and participant action research that's happening through the process, and it's applied user experience. And as a method, this is following exactly what the design best practices are. Getting students to actively participate and engage in class is not the sole challenge of just English language arts, and it's definitely not just the challenge for education. I mean, we see this in information design as well, where we want to keep our students engaged, we want them to have some practical knowledge and application, and we want them to be able to actually share their experiences and understand the process of doing, for example, a usability study. That reluctant reader, those reluctant reader roots, they definitely still come into play in information design as well. And this is where the experiential learning comes into play. So why do we have this evolution into a different area? Well, it's a different way to do collaborative learning, but in an alternative context. And it actually emphasizes student-centered learning through discussion and through role-playing, and getting students to take part in a different role each week that they'll actually encounter in industry, which allows for collaboration and accountability. As we were discussing earlier, students being accountable to me, that's one thing. Students being accountable to each other, that's something else. There's a bit of peer pressure involved in this, where students are like, okay, I'm actually going to get my work ready for this week because I don't want to come into this discussion and not be able to actively contribute. So in the case for my class, we ended up doing randomized groups. I used my patented, jokingly, popsicle stick method, where everyone pulls a different colored popsicle stick at the beginning of class. What they don't know is all the popsicle sticks are also numbered and also have different symbols. So they have to guess, oh, am I going to be grouped based on color, based on symbol, based on number, just to kind of eliminate the chance of students just being put in a group with all of their friends as per usual. And this way you're accountable to your group and also have an idea of, okay, I might not see this person outside of class, but I really do want to maintain this relationship. And like in literature circles, usability circles offer a reflective process. I'm not necessarily grading my students based on the written submissions that they hand in each week, and I'll go over what those look like and what the roles are in a usability circle, for example, on the next slide. But they do submit something written. but that's not necessarily what I'm grading. I am grading the fact that they did this, but what I want to see is them actively participating in each role and really sharing their experiences. So most of the written response is just a reflection on what it felt like to be in the role and to get to participate in that. This falls very much within, I guess, in my line of work, and something that I'm trying to find a way to refer to you as Connie or Dr. Morrison instead of just immediately screaming "Mom" every 5 seconds because we happen to be related.
Mom is fine.
Yeah, great, good. Because it's every time I'm like, oh yes, when we no, it was my mom. So in work, it doesn't really matter what you know, and this is something that my mom has wonderfully screamed from the rooftops ever since I was a child, both in her class and at home. It doesn't matter what you know or how smart you are. If you can't communicate it, none of it's going to matter at the end of the day. And it's something that I pass on to my students because we're working in design, we're working in usability, we're trying to create new products, but those products won't get off the ground if you can't pitch them to someone in a way that makes sense, especially when you're talking about developing new technology or working with AI, things that are big concepts that the general public might not necessarily grasp. People don't necessarily need the technical piece, they just need to know how it's going to impact them. And these usability circles are an opportunity for them to actually communicate with each other more complex ideas in a way that makes sense to them and in a shared language. So what does a usability circle look like? Well, I've narrowed it down to just 4 roles and they're not getting a whole lot of choice, but this is also my first time introducing this to this 3rd-year group. In the future, we're looking at adding, I think, 3 to 4 more roles and having a bit more choice. But for the first round and for our first pilot study of this, we're going to stick with the 4. The first is a pre-case researcher. So a week before the group has to do a usability circle, they receive a brief. And they receive a brief on a product. That could be a digital item like an app or a website or an interactive document, or it could be something physical like a robot, or, and this is a very benign example, but a mug. Their job is to then do all of the background research and prep the study so that when they come to class, role number 2, the moderator and data collector, can actually do the testing and do the plan and collect all of the data. Then we have the participant. Now, there's at least 2 to 3 people per group that act as participant each week, and people get to be a participant more than once. But I would argue that even though students are like, oh, I'll be participant this week, it's going to be the easy role, it's actually the most important one because it puts people in the position of something that they're going to actually be interacting with when they're out in industry. So all my students are going to end up running usability tests likely when they graduate. They're going to work in UX. That's at least where we've been seeing our students be hired. And they're going to be creating these studies. And when they create these studies, they're going to ask people to participate in really weird projects and in really weird usability studies. And being a participant can be uncomfortable. So my goal here is to get them comfortable with being uncomfortable, but also seeing what level they're willing to push so that they never ask a participant to do something that they wouldn't be willing to do themselves or that they haven't done themselves as a participant in one of these circles. That way they're able to share their own insights and challenges, say, okay, this didn't actually really work when someone was doing it this way. Maybe I'll apply a usability case study a different way out in industry. And of course, to finish it all up, we have the data analyst and report writer. I want my students understanding the importance of summarizing data and making it understandable for everybody, not just for their own specific group. So this is stuff that gets shared with the whole class and they get to explain, hey, here's the test we did. Here's how it was summarized and here's how it kind of came together. And here's how it can connect to a product that we're going to work on next week. All right, we'll jump back into evaluation methods.
Okay, so I think the 2 of us.
I'll start with this, but then Lauren, you feel free to jump in. Over the period of time where I've been using literature circles as an assessment tool, I've used a wide range of assessment strategies, and some have been more successful than others. I've always focused on a small piece of written input, just as a way to kind of keep track of students and keep track of their participation in the particular roles and the particular days. But I've also made sure that I've asked, and it's really important that we include in the output an opportunity for students to reflect on the entire process and to give a sense of how they feel like they have grown, or the learning that they have had an opportunity to have during this experience. So there's the element of self-assessment is really, really important, because as a teacher or as an instructor, while these, whether it's a usability circles or whether they're lit circles that are happening, you can't be present for every single conversation that's happening in the classroom. You can, float around and join each and every group and have a conversation for a short period of time and kind of get a sense of how things are going to moderate. But it's impossible to be all places at once. And in many ways, it's important that you're not all places at once, because you do want your students to have authentic and meaningful conversations. And sometimes tough conversations that they won't have if you're at the table. And so the element of self-assessment is important for students to be able to provide some content or some context to how they felt like they were able to contribute to this. It aligns with pedagogies of ungrading, and we're trying to do some different ways of looking at how we're going to come up with the grades. But putting a small section or a small portion of the grade into the students' hands directly, and asking them to reflect on, why do you think you deserved this kind of grade? You justify it to me and you tell me. Often what I'll find is my students will be really quite humble about the learning opportunities they've just had, and they'll suggest a grade that is lower than what I would have given them. And so there's always the agreement that I can change the grade, or I can make it a little bit, reflect a little bit more accurately if I think that's necessary. Sometimes I've used a peer assessment, and that has had mixed success, and I think that would be something you'd have to literally decide based on the class that you have. A lot of it has to do with, especially as we get into the undergrad and graduate grades, it's, I was afraid at first everyone would just give themselves a perfect grade for their contributions. And sometimes the grades tend to be high, but then the reflections come back with a justification of just how much they pushed themselves to think differently or to consider opinions that were different than theirs. And in a course like diversity and social justice, or at a grad level where they're encouraged to think critically, that kind of skill is highly valued and important. So I feel like putting some weight and value back onto those skills is important as well. So this is sort of an ongoing, and I change it all the time. And Lauren, I don't know how you're managing the assessment part of this, but maybe you want to speak to that as we move into the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we jump to the next slide, like when I look at the material that my students are producing, yes, to a degree, there has to be some sort of written output, because we're looking at like an assessment of, were you able to plan this project, and what was the data you collected, and how was it analyzed? Show me visually. So there is that written aspect. And of course, we can't be in all places at once. I definitely don't want to be interrupting them as they're doing their usability study, but I absolutely incorporate that same self-reflection piece as their graded material. They sit back and they have to say, okay, this is what I did. Did it make sense? Did I like this? And because they do a series of, I believe, 6 usability circles, that's what I have scheduled for this semester. 6 usability circles over the course of the semester. With each one, they're changing how they approach it. They're approaching it from that different role, that different perspective, and then reflecting back on, okay, well, now I'm going to be a participant again. Like what's different this time? And they have to, in their reflection, compare and contrast to all the other usability experiences they've had. So it's participant before being someone who can run a circle, and it's interesting to see how they reflect on each of the activities and what their reflections look like week after week, because their reflection as a participant and their reflection as someone who did the pre-case research are often very different. Like what they think the plan is going to go like, and how they think the plan is going to work versus how the plan was actually executed are often very different. So it's nice for them to also see and reflect on that. Our next slide here, we have addressing artificial intelligence and plagiarism through this method. And before I turn it back to you, Mom, I just want to briefly go over how some of these areas are actually, or basically how this method can be used, right? So the first is the original perspectives of the participants and of the students. So each student to each discussion is bringing something new to the table. So there's a potential to do original research here in terms of like with the usability studies, like they are actually conducting an original research on, for example, the usability of this mug, but they're also bringing their own lived experience, and it becomes a bit phenomenological in that way, where we emphasize applying your own past to the current project. So they're interacting with, observing, and analyzing in real time, yes, this material, but also how each of their different perspectives are contributing to the experience that they're all sharing and the shared output. We can also see this through their personalized reflections, of course. We're seeing their lived experience. How did this apply to the work that they're doing? And the reflections on their in-class interactions, because they're not just reflecting on the process, they're reflecting on the conversations. And oftentimes we see come up in that self-assessment, not just, okay, I did this and I interacted with this and I thought this way. It's someone else's perspective on this actually challenged how I would discuss it and how I would think about it. And then they end up talking not just about their own experiences, but other people's experiences as well. Because of these original perspectives, because of this original research, and because of this personalized aspect to it, it's kind of hard to have ChatGPT reflect on your own personal experience. You'd have to first write it and at least put in your own input saying, I've had these experiences, please connect them to this experience. And at that point, they've already written what you would expect them to in that self-reflection. So it's lowering the barrier for entry for them to basically give them the opportunity to share what they would share anyway. Just this time, instead of with the AI to get it to write it nicer, they're actually putting it in and submitting it through D2. Do you still have D2L?
We do.
Brightspace? Yeah. Then we look at like the collaborative effort of this. Mum, do you want to take this one?
Sure, if I can.
Again, because this is a group discussion and it's really about reading content and having meaningful discussion from multiple perspectives, that's not something that they're likely to, I'm not saying they can't, but it's not likely something that they will turn to ChatGPT for. They're actually, when this happens, when these lit circles are happening in the classroom, it's lots of really great conversation and chatter happening, and it's a lively space. I don't see students, checking in to see, what generative AI will come up with. They are genuinely sharing their lived experience and their perspectives based on that. So it's just, and the nature of the collaboration makes it something that doesn't make sense. It just doesn't, it doesn't even factor in as an alternative or as an option. And because every class is different, every chapter, every usability study, every novel, or every couple chapters in the novel offer a new piece of content to grapple over, and the students are bringing new roles each time. It's a real dynamic space. It's a really dynamic kind of assessment or activity for the students to be part of. And again, it just doesn't lend itself very well. And it's not a written project. So it doesn't lend itself at all to leaning back into AI. And in terms of critical thinking, just to kind of reiterate what we've been saying over and over again, this is about the communications, it's about the collaborative work, it's about feeding off one another's ideas, and it's about generating ideas and expanding what we know and taking it from here to here, and learning from our peers. All these social things that are so important to the context of teaching, learning, and knowing, and that universities are supposed to be about. So I think that's all I have for that, Lauren, unless you wanted to add anything.
No, just like when we talk about unique scenarios, even if they're doing even if the students are reading the same book, or they're doing a usability study on the same device or app or product, the tests that they choose to do and the perspectives that they bring completely change the output that they give. So for me, like I can say like, okay, you're going to be doing a usability test on this mug. What they decide that test will be is actually very dependent on their own experience and their own background research. I don't see people doing the same test over and over and over again across my groups. So no matter what product I'm bringing to them, they're actually doing something different each time. And you can see how you would think it's all the same thing, but everyone actually is bringing their own experience to each.